I recently shared a video in which I talked about a couple of things not to say to a survivor when they're disclosing childhood trauma. And somebody asked a question, so what do I say? Well, what to say can be a little bit more complicated, and I want to talk a little bit more about that today. Welcome, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for watching. So this is helpful, I think, for people that might have somebody disclose to them. I think it's also quite helpful for people that are considering disclosing themselves to somebody, because there's often a lot of fears and doubts. So I would love for you to share, as a survivor, in the comments, what would you like to hear from somebody? And maybe you're not quite sure, so maybe some of the things that I talk about might spur you on. And maybe you'll have a different opinion about it, and that's important too. So even with what not to say, everybody's different. And so while there might be some general things that are probably not the best responses, for some people, it may not feel that way. The things I talked about were very, probably pretty universal. So I felt pretty comfortable sharing those. I think it was 2 things. There will be a link in a description if you haven't seen that video. What to say to somebody. Now, this might seem pretty clear-cut, but I think one of the things that's really important for people to understand, both those who might listen to somebody who's disclosing and for the person disclosing, what works or what feels good to one person may not land in the same way to somebody else, even with pretty similar circumstances. And I think sometimes we, both as listeners and survivors, can kind of get caught up in this idea of right and wrong, and that it's very clear-cut. Now, there might be some situations that are fairly clear-cut, like I was mentioning in the other video, and certainly also in terms of what do you say. But when we think about this is the right thing and this is the wrong thing, when that's our primary focus, it can end up creating circumstances in which we become a little bit rigid and we're not particularly present when it's happening. So I'm going to kind of talk about more generally some of the things that we might be able to say, and also kind of why, because the way that I say it may not be the language that you would necessarily use, may not be the language that the survivor uses, and therefore might hit a little bit different for them. And if you've got questions or anything, please feel free to leave them in the comments. If you disagree, let me know that, because I'm surely going to miss some aspects in this. And again, everybody is different. And even culturally, there can be some differences as well. So this is a very general idea of things that you'd likely be able to say that are most likely going to be received in a pretty positive way. Now, it's also important as a survivor to recognize that there could be any number of reasons that even if somebody is saying kind of the perfect thing, so to speak, how we experience it on the receiving end may feel anything but perfect. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So when somebody is disclosing for the survivor, generally speaking, they've likely thought about it for quite a long time. Maybe role-played it in their mind, maybe even role-played it with a therapist potentially. They've had tons of fears about it. They've likely had a lot of shame and doubt come up around the idea of disclosing. So you might be hearing something for the very first time, and it might come completely out of the blue. But for that survivor, it's likely something that they've been considering for a while. Now, there might be some circumstances in which just the circumstances themselves, the people involved, whatever, it might tend to happen at kind of a spur of the moment, completely unexpected. And in those cases, that survivor might feel a little bit more vulnerable. But no matter what, that survivor is going to feel vulnerable, even if they don't necessarily recognize that they feel vulnerable. So for both the listener and the survivor to recognize that is really important, that disclosing abuse, especially if it's not something that you've talked much about, not something that you've really shared with people, or the person you're sharing with really means a lot to you. There's going to be a tremendous amount of vulnerability. And in that vulnerability, how you say it, what you choose to say, how you feel about what you've said, and what you take from what the person says back to you, all of that can be affected by the level of vulnerability that you're feeling going into it, even if not conscious. So for the listener, really recognizing that, really recognizing the level of vulnerability that somebody might be experiencing coming into that. Now, that doesn't mean that you are ultimately responsible for how that person feels, because that can be something that people take on and then feel overwhelmed and maybe don't say anything or try to change the subject or move them away from it, trying to get them into a more positive place, because that's how we tend to cope with things. So if we can release some of the pressure and expectation, that can go a long way. So there are some things that I think are ideas ultimately for people to be able to hear or experience that can be very healing when they disclose. So one of the most important things is expressing that you believe them. Now, how you say that may look very different depending on yourself, depending on who that person is to you, other things that you might want to say, but letting the person know that you believe them can be really important, because there's kind of a universal fear, again, even if it's not a really conscious fear, that the person isn't going to believe them. Or even if they believe that it happened, that they're not going to believe it entirely in the way that they're telling it. Or they'll think that maybe they're overreacting, that they're making it a bigger deal than it is, or even potentially be blamed or judged as a result of it. So being able to express that you believe that what they're telling you is real, that you don't doubt them, that is really important. Along with that, also being able to express, it needs to feel true for you. And I across the board, I wouldn't want you, and nor would they, want you to say something that you don't actually feel or believe, because they're already going to second guess everything that you're saying. There's a good chance that's going to happen. And if they feel on an energetic level that what you're saying isn't genuinely what you're thinking or feeling, they're going to then have some evidence, so to speak, that they can't basically trust anything that you're saying. So it's important that it feels real to you. Don't say it because somebody told you to say it. But if it feels real to you, and I hope that it would, because it is such a vulnerable thing that this person is doing, that you really value, that you appreciate, that it means a lot to you, that they've chosen to share it with you, that they trust you enough to share it with you, that you mean enough to them that they would want to share that with you. So lots of different ways of thinking about that, lots of different ways to say it, and there's probably a lot more. But the idea is, when somebody is choosing to share with you, it means that you mean something to them. It means that what you think matters. It means that their relationship with you matters. It means that they value you. They value your input and your response. And recognizing that, being able to really take that in, that this person is choosing you because of how they value you. So acknowledging that it means something to you as well, that they're choosing you to be the person that they share with. Because for the most part, survivors do not just go around sharing with everybody. Now, I will say that there are some people, because that's part of how they kind of cope in a sense, that find it very easy in a sense, and I put that in quotes because it's technically not really easy, but it feels, or it appears that it's easy, where they can just tell everybody that they meet that they were sexually abused or something. That's a little bit different, but for the majority of people disclosing that you're going to hear disclosed to you, it's likely something that they've given a lot of thought to and they're feeling really vulnerable around. So when you acknowledging what it means to you and recognizing that it does mean something to the other person, but it means something to you, that they're choosing you, that they trust you, that can also be really important, because survivors often have this idea, and unfortunately sometimes it is true, but we often have this idea that the person doesn't want to know, that we're going to burden them, that they're going to be upset. So when you can acknowledge that you appreciate, or you're grateful, or that it means something to you that they've chosen to share with you, it helps alleviate some of that. Letting them know that that you will hold their confidence, that you appreciate them trusting you, and that it will not leave the room that you're in. And you have to mean that. And it's important that you honor that, because it's the survivor's story to tell. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of this because this could be a whole separate video. But if that person is telling you that somebody abused them, that you know the abuser, you may want to share that with other people. You may feel responsible for sharing that with other people. And this is one of those things where you might get different responses from different people. I'm saying this as somebody who has worked with survivors and was a therapist for over 20 years. It's important that you honor the trust of that person telling you. And it's not your story to share. So letting them know that they can trust that it's not going to leave that conversation or that relationship that you have with that person. Now, one caveat to that, if you are a mandated reporter, now there are different types of careers or jobs or professions in which you are a mandated reporter, and it might be different based on country. If you are a mandated reporter, there's a good chance the person disclosing to you already knows that. And if not, before they get into it too much, you might want to let them know that. Now, what you can do with that is, because I'm a mandated reporter, right now, maybe it's best for you not to tell me unless you want me to do something with this information. Let me back up for a second. Maybe it's best for you not to tell me who it is, or maybe it's, that would probably be the most important thing, because in order to make a mandated report, you need to be able to give them a name. So I don't want to get off on a whole tangent about mandated reporting, but generally speaking, most of you are probably not mandated reporters. And so knowing that conversation is not going to leave your relationship is really important. If you want me to talk more about mandated reporting, I can, but again, it's different in different places, and different professions do it a little bit differently. So it's a little bit of a complicated thing there. But if you're a mandated reporter, you know what is required of you. So being able to honor that reality along with this person and what they're sharing with you. So for example, as a mandated reporter, when somebody would disclose to me, particularly like as a therapist, I don't think it's happened in my personal life, But they would often fear, am I going to have to report this? And what I would say to them is that there are varying circumstances which would make me have to report that. And I would give them the criteria for that. And in addition to that, I would also have to know who the person is, their name, and where they are located. So then ultimately they could choose whether or not they shared that information with me. So that's all I'm going to say about that part. I wrote down a few different things here, so I'm just making sure that I cover everything. Another thing that I think can be really helpful to say, and this is certainly one of those things that depending on the survivor, depending on where they're at, depending on other experiences with disclosure, among other things, this can be a really good thing. For some survivors, it can create some challenges. And that is being able to acknowledge something along the lines of basically the significance of what happened to them. So something similar to, I'm really sorry that happened, or I'm really sorry that you're hurting, or I'm really sorry that you were betrayed. Anything kind of like that. But basically what you're doing is you're acknowledging, you're validating that person's not only experience, but their pain. Even if they say, well, it's not a big deal, or you have nothing to be sorry about, like that's a lot of times what people will say is, well, you didn't do it, you have nothing to be sorry about. And in a way, there's some self-protective things often going on there, including maybe worrying about that you're feeling bad about something. But there's other self-protective pieces going on there too. So I'm sorry can be incredibly meaningful. It can also be a little challenging for people to hear. But when you can say what it is that you're feeling sorry about, obviously you're not sorry that you did it because you didn't do it, but you're sorry that the person that you care about, this person who means something to you, who is trusting you, you're sorry that they're in pain. You're sorry that they were betrayed and that they missed out on so many things that they should have been able to experience, right? Again, this needs to feel true for you, but being able to express those types of things can be really helpful. So a simple I'm sorry can sometimes suffice, but I think it's helpful for you to also recognize what is it that you're actually saying sorry for, because then it can help the survivor recognize that you're not just saying something that you think you should say. Let's see. Oftentimes when people are disclosing, sometimes they just feel like they need to say it. They just need to practice using their voice, just get it out because they've held on to the secret for so long. Sometimes they're wanting a lot of support. Sometimes they're wanting validation. The reality is oftentimes that survivor doesn't really know what they're wanting. And so as the person listening, it can be really difficult because if they don't even know what they're looking for, how can you possibly give them what they're looking for? So this is where like thinking of it as the right thing and the wrong thing really comes in, and moving away from that idea. So being able to say something along the lines, again, needs to feel true for you, is, maybe as you're saying, that you appreciate them sharing this with you, letting them know that you want to support them. And maybe even acknowledging, I'm not really sure what to say, but I want to support you. I'm really not sure what to say, but I believe you and I want to support you. And I am so grateful that you share this with me. Like you could say things along those lines. Being able to acknowledge, I don't know what to say, can be really powerful. And I think depending on the nature of the relationship and the other context of things that you're saying, a survivor is going to appreciate that because you're being authentic. You're acknowledging that you don't really know what to say, but you're also acknowledging that you want to be there, that you believe them, that you want to support them, whatever that might mean. And even asking, like, what can I do to support you? Or can I do anything to support you? Maybe even, what do you need from me right now? And that can go over a couple of different ways, but maybe, is there anything that I can do? And that person is likely going to say no, or I don't know, because maybe they really don't. And that's okay. You don't need to figure it out. But just saying that can go a really long way, because all of that helps them know that you believe them, that you're not judging them, and that you want to be with them in it. Now, to support them doesn't mean that you need to help them heal. The nature of your relationship will be healing to them. The nature of how you respond to them in disclosure will be healing for them. So those are the things that I have written down. Like I said, there may be a lot of other things. And again, whether you've been somebody on the receiving end of a disclosure or you've disclosed and you've experienced something that was helpful to you, please feel free to share it in the comments. I think this is a really great learning opportunity for everybody. And as survivors, again, like, think about the things that I said. Is there anything that I said that, if you think about hearing it, would it not feel good to you? Maybe you've heard something similar and it didn't feel good, and maybe thinking about it a little bit differently, you can recognize maybe where that person was coming from. Because when we are in that really vulnerable place, if you have shame, if you believe that you're going to be blamed or judged, if you're terrified of speaking it out loud, it's so incredibly easy to interpret anything. And when I say anything, I mean literally anything that somebody says or does, a look, shifting their body, anything. We can take that, because we're already in this really fearful, anticipatory place. We can take that as the so-called evidence that they don't believe us, that they don't want to hear it. Whatever it is that we've told ourselves, all those fears that we've held on to, we can take anything as evidence to reinforce that. So if you're a survivor who has disclosed or is considering disclosing, recognizing that that's a very significant potential for you as you are experiencing all of that unfold, so that you can take better care of yourself, so that you can be a little bit more mindful if somebody is sharing some of these things, or maybe asking a question. That's another thing actually that I want to address, is it is very natural as somebody on the receiving end of a disclosure to have questions. Very natural, and there's nothing wrong with that. What I would suggest, generally speaking, is that you ask if it's okay to ask a question. Now, that person may feel obligated to answer your question, so they might say yes out of obligation. They may say no, and that would be a really good boundary for them to be able to do that if, in fact, they're not ready for questions. But there are some people who actually want to be asked questions so that they can really share more. That doesn't mean that you are obligated to ask questions. But if you have questions, I think it is perfectly reasonable to ask if it's okay to ask a question. And then that person, it's important for them to be able to honor themselves and where they're at. And if you ask a question that they're not ready to answer, that they can say, yes, you can ask a question, but there might be some things I'm not ready to talk about. And then you, of course, have to respect that. Or maybe they're open to all questions, but then the question you ask hits them in a way that they didn't quite expect. And then maybe they can say, oh, I'm not sure I really am ready to talk about that. So again, this is for both the receiving person and the disclosing person. But in those moments, it can be really hard to know what feels really present for you and what it would really look like to honor that. So it's reasonable to have questions. It's also reasonable to ask, as long as you ask for permission to ask questions. And as the disclosing person, it's okay to answer some questions. If you don't want to answer any, that's okay. If you want to answer some, that's okay. Being able to communicate that for both people is really important and not easy to do, especially in a moment like that. One thing, this goes more to the side of what not to do, is particularly if it's the first time you're having a conversation as the receiving person, if it's the first time this person is having a conversation with you about it, I wouldn't necessarily suggest asking a lot of detail types of questions. If they haven't shared with you who the abuser is, I think you can ask that, but you can also ask or say, can I ask who it was? And if you don't want to tell me, that's okay. Because a lot of times survivors will think that you wouldn't want to know who it is. So having said that, you also need to be prepared for who they might say it is, because it might be somebody that you know. So if you're not prepared for that, then maybe don't ask that question. I also think it's really important as somebody on the receiving end of a disclosure, especially if it is somebody that you know, the perpetrator is somebody that you know, it might be really helpful for you to see a professional, maybe just once, especially if it's somebody that you've had any sort of relationship with. I would encourage you to consider seeing somebody professionally, a therapist who understands the dynamics around what it means to be sexually abused, has a lot of experience with childhood sexual abuse. Because if you have had any sort of relationship with that perpetrator, or if you know that perpetrator and you're learning for the very first time that that person perpetrated abuse on somebody that you have a relationship with, especially, it's going to be difficult for you to hear that, most likely. It can bring up a lot of different kinds of things. You might even feel guilty and responsible, like you should have known. So it is something I would encourage you to consider strongly. I would encourage you. It might just be one session. It might be more, depending on the nature of the relationship that you might have with that perpetrator. Also recognize, as somebody who is on the receiving end of a disclosure, that it might bring up some stuff for you, even if you don't know the perpetrator. Obviously, if you have a history of childhood abuse, it could bring up some stuff for you. But even if you don't, it could still bring up some things for you that maybe there's some similarities or some feelings that are somewhat familiar. Being on the receiving end of disclosure is truly an honor, because it means that that person values and trusts you. It can also be, it's a big thing. It's a big thing to learn. It's a big thing to hold. Now, that doesn't mean, if you're a survivor listening to this, it doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong and you shouldn't burden somebody. And depending on the receiving person's well-being, their own mental health, that will go a long way in how they experience receiving a disclosure. But even for somebody that is in a pretty good place emotionally, sometimes it can be helpful. If you find that like you're really having difficulty wrapping your head around it, which is natural, especially if you have a relationship with that person. If you're second guessing a lot of things, that's also natural, because you're basically having to go back and kind of rework everything that you know about that person, which is normal and natural. But sometimes that can be difficult, again, especially if you've got your own stuff. Even if it's just maybe difficulty in trusting people or trusting yourself even. So lots of things there to consider. So if you're the receiver, don't feel bad if you find yourself struggling a little bit, and consider talking to somebody. If you are the person disclosing and that person maybe is having a hard time wrapping their head around it, it doesn't mean that you are wrong in sharing it. Finding a way to wrap your head around it can actually be a healing experience, not just specifically around this person being a perpetrator, but it can actually be a helpful thing for people to process, because it can translate into other areas of self-doubt and trust and different kinds of things like that as well. But ultimately, it is an honor to be on the receiving end of disclosure. It is important to honor yourself as the recipient of that disclosure. Whatever might be coming up for you, it is important to honor that. If you are the survivor, recognizing that when we care about somebody and they're struggling with something, we want them to be able to share that with us, right? And if you had a friend who was abused as a child and they want to share that with you, my guess is you would want them to be able to share that with you. So don't take anything that I'm saying or your already pre-existing ideas. Don't let any of that feel, or don't take that in a way to let it reinforce that you shouldn't share. Because the way that we heal, the way that we reduce the shame and stigma associated with this is by talking about it. And much of the way that we talk about it is by disclosure. And disclosure can be an incredibly, incredibly healing experience. Actually, for both people. So, again, I'd love to hear from you, whatever came up for you as you listened. And really, I would love for you to share your own experiences, what maybe stood out to you, what you would or wouldn't like to hear, or if you were on the receiving end, how you responded, how you felt, even if it wasn't expressed in that way. Because it can feel, we can have a lot of different thoughts and feelings, and sometimes as humans we're not great at expressing what is really on our heart for all kinds of reasons. So let's connect in the comments. Thank you so much for being here. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. And if you found this helpful, please consider sharing it with somebody else. It really can help facilitate conversations about this kind of thing that I think really are quite important. So thank you for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.